Hi everyone, I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed champion guide. Today I'll be covering our second newest champion, Destiny, the Sky Ranger, and so please sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Destiny is a strong ranged DPS champion who excels in dealing high burst damage with a blaster at medium to long ranges. While I think that Destiny is fairly beginner friendly because she doesn't need to put in a lot of effort to at least contribute to winning the fight, I think that she's also a decently high skill cap champion that might appeal to players who like challenges and mastering a hard to play well champion, because she doesn't have many survival options and her potential for doing massive amounts of burst damage will require a fair amount of practice and work. Champions with few survival options typically have more than average ways of controlling fights, and so Destiny is no different. She has access to silencers, stuns, spell blocks, snares and knockbacks in the base kit, and so being good at controlling the fight from a distance and having really good positioning would be what you need as a good Destiny player. So for these reasons, I think some practice with Destiny is definitely required before you can start to see good results with her, especially if you're up against multiple melee enemies who are really trying to chase after you. So yeah, in short, I think Destiny is a pretty good champion. She's pretty strong against other ranged enemies, controlling and dealing lots of burst damage, but a little weaker in the surviving part and melee champions. So yeah, that was just a brief summary of Destiny as a champion. Now I'll just quickly give a rundown on how this video is structured before I get into the meat of the guide. As with my older champion guides, I have split this guide up into 5 sections, and that's abilities, playstyle, Battlerites, loadouts, and team comps. I've included timestamps directly to each section in the description below, so feel free to jump directly to a certain section that you need if you wish. I'd like to point out that I do not have a gameplay tips section in my champion guides anymore, since I feel like some of the tips are quite repetitive from champion to champion, and so these little gameplay tips will instead pop up in the video when they are relevant, I suppose. And so yeah, with all that being said, let's begin. First off, abilities. Destiny's most one ability is Power Blaster, and this is a basic range projectile attack. What it does is Destiny will fire a simple projectile which deals 16 damage to the enemy that it hits, and it will also reduce the cooldown of a mouse 2 ability, Charge Bolt, by 1 second. This makes it quite important for you to hit your mouse ones as often as possible, since Destiny's mouse 2 ability, which we will get to soon, is arguably one of her best abilities. So far, pretty simple. Moving on, Destiny's mouse 2 ability is Charge Bolt, and this is her main source of single target burst damage. What it does is Destiny can charge up her attack by holding down mouse 2 for up to 1.2 seconds, and the longer she charges this up, the range of the attack will increase, and she also deal more damage to the target that it hits. In addition to the large amount of damage, the target that is hit by the ability will also be inflicted with the spell block debuff, and this debuff basically interrupts the next ability that the target will try to cast, and it makes the target silenced and unable to cast any abilities if the interrupt was successful. Because the debuff only lasts about 0.5 seconds, you typically have to time it in such a way where the enemy is already casting something or are about to cast something to make use of the silence. Having said that though, most people will just use it for the damage from afar and only use it for the silence if the melee enemy is already very close and are about to attack you. While the mouse 2 ability has a 7-second cooldown, bear in mind that her mouse 1 ability reduces that cooldown if you hit with the mouse 1s, and so you can expect to have your mouse 2 ready again if you manage to hit about 3 mouse 1s shortly after using your last mouse 2 shot. So yeah, it's worth it to practice getting used to her mouse 1 animations and timings, since you can put out a lot more mouse 2s that way. Next up, Destiny's spacebar ability is Magnetic Orb, and this is her main movement ability. What it does is Destiny will turn into a ball, removing any movement impairing effects and increasing movement speed by 125% at the same time. And then she can pretty much roll around for 2 seconds to reposition herself. If she hits an enemy in her ball form, she will deal 16 damage to the target and knocks them back a decent distance, and so this is probably your best way at gaining distance from a melee enemy who has managed to get close to you. Having said that, do be careful when trying to knock people back, because it can only hit an enemy once and it also triggers counters. Triggering counters would be pretty bad for you since it completely nullifies the knockback as well, which wouldn't be what you want, especially against melee enemies. Another thing to be careful of as well is that you're not invulnerable while using the ball, and so be careful not to get hit by attacks and stuff thinking you can tank them since you're invulnerable or something. It took me a while to get used to it not giving invulnerability as well, since it was kind of similar to Thorn's spacebar ability. If you're using the spacebar ability offensively, it might be worth knowing that you can cancel it prematurely with C, so that you can continue shooting at the enemy after using the spacebar to knock back and deal damage, without having to wait for the ball duration to finish. A neat little trick you could possibly do with the spacebar ability as well would be to knock the central orb toward your team, so that it is easier and safer for you guys to take the orb for yourselves when it spawns. Moving on, Destiny's Q ability is Sky Strike, and this is a counter ability. What it does is Destiny will start channeling her counter, and if she receives a projectile or melee attack in that time, she'll negate that attack, fly into the air, and start to fire an AoE attack which deals 22 damage at the targeted location. This AoE attack does a little knockback as well, and so you can sometimes use it to knock the central orb around, knock enemies into other AoE attacks, and so on. It also doesn't trigger counters, so that's incredibly useful. After the attack is fired, Destiny will also jump a short distance toward a certain direction, depending on which movement keys are being held down. So yeah, while the ability is useful for giving you invulnerability for a short while, it's not really that great at gaining distance from the enemy, since that jump range isn't very long at all. In Destiny's base kit, as in without Battlerites and all that, this ability is her only iframe, and so you might want to try to think about the best times you can use it and all that, depending on what champions you're facing. Wasting it can be quite bad, since you wouldn't really have any other iframe abilities to dodge other hard-hitting abilities, and you will need to rely on her other abilities to survive for a while, and that may not be ideal. Next up, Destiny's E ability is Plasma Wall, and what it does is Destiny will deploy a Plasma Wall at a targeted location for 2.5 seconds, and this Plasma Wall can slow projectiles flying through it, and snare enemies that pass through it as well. The wall is kind of like Ashkar's Firewall ability, but just be careful that the projectiles are only slowed in Destiny's Wall ability, and so they will continue their original trajectory after the Plasma Wall wears off. This Plasma Wall ability is what makes Destiny really good against other ranged champions, since she can periodically shoot at enemies freely, while the enemies cannot shoot back as easily. When trying to use this ability to snare melee enemies, you have to be a little bit careful because the snare effect only happens after they walk out of the wall's area of effect. And so what that means is that if you simply put the wall on top of the enemy, they will not be slowed until they walk past the boundaries of the area. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. Just like Ashkar's Firewall, this ability is especially useful when you're trying to contest for the central orb, since you can make it significantly harder for enemy ranged champions to get that last hit on the central orb. So yeah, that's about it on Destiny's abilities which doesn't require energy. Now let us move on to those which do. Destiny's R ability is Mega Sphere, and this ability is quite unique. For 25 energy, Destiny can shoot a huge energy sphere towards a targeted location. After some time, the sphere will detonate and deal 14 damage to all nearby enemies and inflict the fading snare as well. If you shoot the sphere with your Mouse 1 or Mouse 2 abilities, the sphere will detonate prematurely, and the effects of the Mouse 1 or Mouse 2 attack will be added to the sphere's explosion. So, for example, your Mouse 1 hit deals 16 damage, and so if you shoot the sphere with your Mouse 1 attack, the sphere will deal a total of 30 damage and still inflict the fading snare. If you shoot your Mouse 2 at the sphere, it will deal 14 damage plus the amount of damage you manage to charge up with your Mouse 2, snare your opponents, and also inflict the spell block and silence to all enemies within the area. It's super strong if it's used properly, and I found that this sphere doesn't count as a projectile, and so it can pass through things like Ashkar's Firewall or Thorn's ultimate ability and so on. This is sometimes useful to remember since you can shoot it through these abilities without worry and reposition yourself to try to detonate it with your Mouse 1s or Mouse 2s. Because the sphere is so slow moving and has such powerful effects, I find that using it to separate the enemy team is quite effective. Firing it to a position in between the whole enemy team tends to make them split up, and your teammates can take this opportunity to go in and do some work on the enemies. Because it is better to detonate the sphere manually, I find that it is better used as a medium range attack rather than a short or long range one. In shorter ranges, enemy champions might body block your Mouse 1 or Mouse 2 attacks, and so you'll be unable to detonate the sphere early. In longer ranges, enemies have plenty of time to move out of the area, and so it can be hard to get it to hit as well in those situations. So yeah, medium range seems to be the best range for this ability. While the ability can pass through things like Ashkar's Firewall, the sphere cannot pass through the walls that are present on the map. It will actually explode the moment it touches the wall, and so this can actually be quite useful sometimes, since you can use it directly at a wall to snare nearby melee enemies if you're backed up against a wall with no good way of escaping. Hopefully that snare is enough to get you some space to get out of there before taking more damage than you need to. So yeah, quite a versatile ability. There's a neat little combo you can do with this ability if you have a certain Battlerites, so I'll share that with you later when we get to a later section. Onto her EX abilities. Her first EX ability is a shift left click ability, Transform Weapon. What this ability does for 25 energy is Destiny will transform her weapon into a defensive mode for 5 seconds. During this 5 seconds, Destiny's Mouse 1 attack is slightly changed, and she'll also gain a shield to protect herself. Her Mouse 1 attacks now deal reduced damage to enemies, but it can be used to also shield allies by shooting her Mouse 1s at them. At first, her own personal shield only blocks up to 10 damage, but if you manage to successfully hit any target with your Mouse 1, while the effects of Transform Weapon is still active, you will gain additional shields up to a maximum of 40. In 1v1 situations, this ability makes Destiny quite capable of surviving these 1 vs 1 traits, especially if she's very good at hitting all of her Mouse 1 attacks. She can constantly damage enemies while bolstering her own shields, and so it is very useful in those situations. In situations where your ally is being targeted, switching to this mode for 5 seconds to just cover your ally with shields is also quite a good move sometimes, so that's something to consider if they're almost going to die. So yeah, quite a versatile ability. But just be mindful that you're not invincible, even if you're hitting all your attacks in this defensive form, since 2 enemies targeting you at the same time will overwhelm your shield generation capabilities. Next up, Destiny's second EX ability is a Shift E ability, Lockdown. What it does for 25 energy is Destiny can place a plasma prison at a targeted location, and this prison will inflict a 1.2 second stun to enemies that exit the area. This ability can be very useful, especially on enemies that have used their escape cooldowns, since they cannot just simply walk out of the area, lest they be stunned for 1.2 seconds and will probably take a few easy hits as a result. If they have their escape cooldowns ready, then they can simply jump out. So you'll want to make sure that you get people inside the area to begin with, since the stun is only inflicted on enemies that exit the area, but not when they are entering the area. The best way to use this ability would be to predict where your enemy is moving, and then use it at a location just a little bit behind them. Hopefully they do not have time to react to it, and as a result, get stunned for walking through the prison walls. If you're not very good at doing something like that, since the precise timing might take a bit of practice, an alternative combo you can do is to use the prison on a nearby enemy and then follow it up with a spacebar to knock them out of the area. This is a simple way of proccing the stun on an enemy forcefully, but do be careful if you use this combo since you'll be putting yourself in danger as well if you don't have your spacebar ready for potentially bad situations. While the ability can be used aggressively like how I mentioned, it can sometimes just be used to save yourself from incoming melee enemies as well, since you can position the prison just a little bit behind of where the enemy melee champions are moving towards, and they will be stunned for passing through the walls if they cannot react in time. So yeah, again another interesting and versatile ability which you can be fairly creative with. Finally, last but not least, her ultimate ability on the F key is Pinball. What this does is Destiny will turn herself into this ball and dash forward at very high speeds. While dashing, Destiny is invulnerable, and enemies that are hit by you are dealt 40 damage and stunned for a short time as well. If you come in contact with walls before reaching its maximum distance, you'll bounce off walls up to a total of 3 times before stopping. So with this bouncing effect, if you're good at aiming it and you have a bit of luck on your side, you can effectively hit enemies up to a maximum of 4 times, and each of these hits on the same target will deal 50% less damage than the previous hit. So effectively this means that you can potentially hit a single enemy for up to a maximum of 75 damage with a single ultimate ability. In most cases, you'll typically just hit an enemy once and then bounce off to somewhere else. Hitting an enemy twice is pretty awesome, but if you can hit them 3 times, you'll probably also hit them a 4th time, because this ability is considered an AoE ability, it will not proc counters, and it is very good at hitting multiple enemies since it has such a high movement speed. You typically want to try to at least hit 2 enemies with it with the initial charge, and hopefully with a bit of luck, you can hit some of them at least once more before the ability ends. Do remember that you need to hit a wall before the ability reaches its maximum range to bounce, so you might need to adjust a little bit if the nearest wall is too far away. Because of the highly unpredictable nature of this ability, quite a bit of practice will probably be needed to get consistently good results with it, so don't be too discouraged if a lot of your pinballs end up bringing you halfway across the map without really achieving anything in the process. You'll get better at it eventually. If you're not the one who likes to leave things to chance, then I suppose using your energy on her EX abilities or her R ability would be better so that you get consistent results each time. I just think that the ultimate is super fun, and so I enjoy using it fairly often. And so yeah, that's about it for Destiny's abilities. Let us move on and talk a little bit more about her playstyle. Destiny's playstyle is a little bit of a passive one where you'll probably be looking to attack from a medium to long range with your mouse 1s and mouse 2s, since the bulk of your damage will typically come from those mouse 1s and mouse 2s, and all of her other abilities are more situational. Because of Destiny's lack of proper escape cooldowns, you'll be saving her spacebar and Q abilities for tough situations where enemy melees might be chasing you or you're trying to avoid large ranged attack damage. Unless of course the enemy is really close to dying, then maybe you can justify using spacebar offensively for the burst damage it provides. Even though you can use your E to slow projectiles and consequently use those slowed projectiles to easily trigger your counter for some damage, I'd recommend saving your Q for escaping or being invulnerable for a couple of seconds during tough phases, since you want to have as much time to let your spacebar recharge or give yourself a little bit more space at times. I feel that the E ability is best used when you're trying to trade against enemy ranged champions or when the orb is up and you want to stop enemy ranged characters from easily taking it. Depending on what Battlerites you take, you may want to use the E ability differently to this, but we'll get there later. If you're not as keen on using Destiny's ultimate as often, then using the energy for your EXE and R abilities could be a good way of securing some nice damage onto enemies. Your EXE is really good, especially at times where you and your teammates are in position to attack a single enemy. Locking down an enemy without escapes into that tiny area is extremely devastating to that poor enemy, and so you want to find opportunities to allow this to happen. As I mentioned earlier, the R ability is quite versatile, so you can use it for some nice burst damage on the immobile central orb, use it to zone enemy team members away from each other, or perhaps use it to snare or deter incoming melee enemies. Bear in mind that the R ability is more useful at a medium range, and so if you feel you may not be able to utilize it properly, but you have already shot it out, you can just ignore it and do what you need to do, since it is not a big deal. A good combo I've seen people use with the R ability is to knock back an incoming target with spacebar, immediately cancel your spacebar with C to let you fire abilities again, and follow it up with an R on top of the target and then detonate it with your mouse 1. About Destiny's Shift Mouse 1 ability, usage of this ability is less crucial since it is more of a supportive or defensive ability, but nevertheless it is still a very useful ability to use in the right situations. It shines the most when you're in a 1v1 situation against another champion and you're slightly below on health, since you can typically out-trade enemies in those cases. If your ally is in danger of being focused and you know that they might take increasing amounts of damage soon, then using it to save them is also a good choice. In really dire situations, like perhaps you are a couple of hits away from dying, that 5-second shield that you can recharge is extremely useful in keeping you alive just long enough to perhaps get some health back or rejoin a teammate. On to when to use her ultimate ability. I'd say if you know you can get at least 2 enemies with the initial burst and get a couple of bounces off, it would be a pretty good use of the ultimate ability. It is especially disruptive to the enemies if you already have a teammate in position to take advantage of those mini stuns, so that's why you're looking out for those situations to use your ultimate ability. The only times when you don't want the bounces to be too random would be when the death vortex is approaching and you don't have a lot of space, since you wouldn't want to end up somewhere far into the death vortex, as you'd probably cause more harm than good with that ultimate. In those cases where the death vortex is approaching, using your other abilities where you have more control over is probably a better idea than leaving it to chance with your ultimate ability. Unless of course you know that you'll just be bouncing between 2 parallel walls, then I guess that's okay. So yeah, that's mostly on Destiny's playstyle. Now let us move on to Destiny's Battlerites options and loadouts. Because there are so many Battlerites currently, and it will take me a long while to go through and describe all of them one by one, I will just display them here, and if you wish you can go ahead and pause the video to slowly read through them before continuing with the video. And so pause now to read through the first half. And now again for the second half. Okay, now that we've read all of them, let's continue. First off, I think that Destiny has several Battlerites that are often too good to pass up, and so these Battlerites should be in most builds, and these Battlerites are Power Attachment and Dispatch. Power Attachment makes your already strong Mouse 2 ability even stronger in terms of damage, and so it is definitely very useful. The Battlerites used to be a little bit stronger and has been nerfed recently, but even so, it's still a good Battlerites, and I think it should almost always be picked for the damage, since your Mouse 2 now deals 10 to 38 damage depending on charge up, and that's good. Destiny's main weakness is her lack of escapes, and so Dispatch helps to reduce that weakness a little bit by giving her an additional invincibility frame ability. This extra jump that she gets when using her spacebar is super handy for avoiding damaging abilities, creating distance, and jumping over walls to create space from enemies and so on. So it is super useful in helping to keep you alive. One other Battlerites, which I think is really strong, but perhaps don't really need to be in most builds depending on personal preference, is Violent Revolution. This Battlerites is very useful because that 6 damage increase to your spacebar ability is very useful, especially when you're trying to secure the middle orb with it. With a full charge up of your mouse 2, followed by a hit on the orb with your spacebar, you can take down the orb from 60 to 0 just like that. This is assuming you have both Power Attachment and Violent Revolution to buff the damage on these two abilities. Another good reason to have the Violent Revolution Battlerites, I suppose, is that the added 20% knockback bonus will make knocking melee enemies away much easier, and so it increases your overall survivability as well. This improved knockback effect also makes that combo I shared earlier about using your R ability much easier to perform, since the increased distance you have from your opponent will make it a little bit easier when you're trying to detonate the R sphere for damage. So yeah, those were to me some of Destiny's Battlerites that are really good. Now we'll look at the others, which are a little bit more situational. When you're up against mostly melee champions, Battlerites such as Energy Conversion, Sizzle, and Expansion Pack can be quite useful. Energy Conversion makes it so that you can survive a little bit longer after using your Q ability to counter a melee attack, so that's super handy when dealing with melee enemies who refuse to stop attacking you. Bear in mind that the Q ability jump doesn't really take you very far, and so melee enemies can very easily catch up to you again shortly after you use your Q ability. So the Battlerites helps you to survive their attacks a little bit more. The rooting effect that you can apply with your E ability when you take the Sizzle Battlerites is really helpful when you're up against melee enemies, since you can make it almost impossible for them to just walk up to you and attack you. They will need to use some form of movement ability or run the long way around your plasma wall just to get in range of you, so that's why the Battlerites is very useful against melees. I suppose it can be useful against some ranged champions as well that don't have as many movement abilities, since you can use it offensively and root them in place for you to shoot them, but I think this Battlerites' main purpose is its use against melee enemies. Expansion Pack can be useful against melee enemies because of the increased fading snare duration and its reduced cooldown. Your R ability is a good way of stopping melee enemies from running straight towards you, from a medium range at least, and so having this Battlerites allows you to slow their approach more often and more effectively. Against teams with mostly ranged champions, Plasma Infusion, Globetrotter, Blast Processing, and Lasting Plasma are some nice Battlerites to have. Most of the time when you're dueling against another ranged champion, you'll mostly be trying to put a plasma wall between you and them, so that their projectiles are slowed and you can win the trade more easily that way. So if you take Plasma Infusion, you'll make it much easier for your projectiles to hit your enemy with the increased range when you fire your projectiles through that plasma wall, and the shield you get is a nice bonus to your health sustainability as well. Globetrotter is nice to have against ranged enemies because the movement speed and duration it gives you opens up the option to use your spacebar offensively on ranged enemies if you need to, and the movement speed also makes it much easier to avoid abilities and reposition. Blast Processing is nice to have against ranged enemies since you can easily use your Q ability for some nice damage after countering your enemy's incoming projectiles. While having your Q saved up for survival is generally important when playing Destiny since she doesn't have a lot of escapes, I think that it is less important against an all-ranged enemy team, so using it for damage is not too bad, but you should still be careful if you do decide to use it offensively. Your E ability is your most useful ability when dealing with other ranged champions, and so the reason for taking Lasting Plasma is quite straightforward, and it makes sense when you're fighting mostly ranged opponents since you can slow their projectiles for longer and use it more often as well. So yeah. Onto System Shock, Plasma Booster, and Transformer, these Battlerites can be pretty good options as well, depending on personal preference. If you're pretty good at timing your mouse 2 and cancelling your enemy's casting, then taking System Shock will make them have a much harder time fighting against you, since that 1.4 second silence duration is actually pretty significant. Plasma Booster makes your E ability very versatile, since you can use those movement speed boosts in very creative ways. You can support your teammates with it, go on the offensive with it, or even use it to run away from things and so on. So yeah, if that's what you like for your playstyle, it can be a pretty interesting pickup. And finally, Transformer is a pickup that is nice to have if you're good at aiming your ultimate ability, and it is also amazing in some maps where there are good parallel walls for you to abuse the bouncing effect of the ultimate ability. The additional bounces don't add up to a lot more damage, but the stun effect is still there, and so you can potentially set up for some nice combos with teammates. That bonus spacebar ability at the end of your ultimate ability can be used for some nice damage or simply just for repositioning, and so that's quite nice to have as well. So yeah, those were my thoughts on most of the Battlerites. Like I mentioned in my beginner tips video, I think you'll want to at least give a bit of thought about what Battlerites you're using before each round, since that is a good way of understanding the champion more, and it will help with making sure you learn what are the best situations to use which Battlerites and so on. But in case you want to quickly take a loadout and jump straight into a game, here are some loadouts that I use. To start off, here's the standard build I take most of the time. I've explained why I like Power Attachment, Dispatch and Violent Revolution, and so these are all in my Destiny builds. The last two Battlerites are more flexible, and so there's no need to follow exactly, and take Sizzle and Expansion Pack as well if you're looking to copy the build. Generally, I like having extra CCs on my abilities and all that, and that's why I take these two Battlerites. But as I usually say, you should try to tailor the build to the situation and your own playstyle as well, so definitely swap Sizzle and Expansion Pack out to what you want or need, or perhaps even Violent Revolution. If you're up against multiple melee champions, this build is already good to go, but if you're up against multiple ranged champions, then I would swap out those two Battlerites for something like Lasting Plasma and Blast Processing when I'm looking to have some fun with Destiny's ultimate, or when there's a map suitable for the ultimate ability. Taking this build could be quite good and fun. If you can use your root on the enemy before you use your ultimate ability on the enemy, hitting enemies with the initial ultimate charge shouldn't be too hard, and it's quite fun as well. So yeah, once again, most of Destiny's Battlerites are all pretty good, so swap around the last two to whatever you like to use, or if you want to include Violent Revolution, the last three to whatever you prefer using. And so yeah, that's about it on Destiny's Battlerites and Loadouts. That was a fairly lengthy part, but we'll now move on to champions that synergize with Destiny before we finish the guide with some final notes on Destiny. On team compositions, I find that Destiny can synergize with most champions quite well, but more so with support teammates I feel, and maybe a bit with melee teammates as well. That's not to say that she's not good with ranged teammates, because she is still good with ranged teammates. It's just that I think that being paired with supports or melees can bring out her potential slightly more. For a champion with not a lot of survivability and sustain, having a support teammate is very useful because they keep you alive for a lot longer, and in the case of Paloma, she can give you an extra 2 iframes that will help you with survival tremendously. Most melee teammates are also nice for Destiny because they are naturally quite good at drawing out your enemy's escape cooldowns, and so landing your important Mouse 1 and Mouse 2 shots are a lot easier. Melee teammates are also really good at drawing attention to them, and that lets you as a Destiny player have a bit more space, and you don't have to worry about surviving all the time as much. That's not to say enemy melee champions will stop attacking you or something, but you will have a slightly easier time at least. So yeah, Destiny is quite a fun champion to play with, but not exactly the easiest to learn and be good at. If you're good at landing your Mouse 1s and Mouse 2s, you'll be able to contribute quite significantly to winning the game already, but playing her properly and well will mean surviving with her limited escape options and using her abilities to control the fight and survive long enough to eventually kill your enemies. And so yeah, that's about it for my Destiny guide. I hope you guys found it useful. From the votes on my Thorn guide a couple of weeks back, Raygon was voted to be the next updated guide after Destiny's, and so you can expect an updated Raygon guide coming soon. Since Alyssa is out now as well, the guide after Raygon's would be on Alyssa before we continue updating my other older champion guides. Because I like to involve you guys a little bit in my video creation process as well, you just need to click on the I button at the top right now and you should see a poll where you can vote for the next champion guide after Alyssa's guide. I am updating the guides of beginner friendly champions first, since those are the most affordable for free to play players, and so the options listed there will just be beginner friendly champions first. The only time I will break this cycle of voting and updating guides will be when there's a new champion release, so don't worry if you don't see the updated guide of the champion you voted for, because it will be coming soon after the champion guide on the new champion. And so yeah, that's about it for this video, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as well. If you did, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, leave any questions or thoughts in the comment section below, share this video with your friends, and you can check out my other videos as well if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching my video, and until next time guys, have a great day, keep gaming, stay chill, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.